What if I told you that the biggest disaster of Hurricane Katrina wasn't the storm itself? It wasn't the 175 millimeters winds. It wasn't the walls of water that swallowed entire neighborhoods. It wasn't even the billions of dollars in destruction. The real catastrophe? The fact that no one came. An entire city left to drown. Families stranded on rooftops, waving desperately for help that never arrived. Thousands begging for food, for water, for a second chance, while the world watched in silence. But in the middle of this chaos, one woman refused to be a victim. She had no power, no money, no government support. Just a camera in her hands and an unshakable belief that if no one was coming to save them, she would become the help they needed. This is the story the news didn't tell you, the story of a woman who turned survival into a mission. Stay with me, because by the end of this video, you'll see why her courage changed everything. The air in New Orleans was thick with the weight of something unseen, something looming just beyond the horizon. It was late August, and the summer heat pressed down on the city like a heavy hand. The smell of fried seafood and sweet beignets drifted from the small restaurants lining Royal Street, mixing with the briny scent of the Mississippi River. Music spilled out of open windows, brass horns, deep drum beats, the heartbeat of a city that had seen it all and kept dancing anyway. Kimberly Rivers Roberts walked through the streets of the lower Ninth Ward, a camcorder slung over her shoulder. She had always recorded things. It wasn't just a hobby. It was how she made sense of the world. She filmed her neighborhood, her people, the way the sunlight hit the shotgun houses at just the right angle in the evening. This was home, and home wasn't just a place. It was a feeling, but something was off. The TV screens inside the corner store flashed red alerts. Hurricane Katrina. Mandatory. Evacuation ordered. The lady behind the counter shook her head. They say that every time. We've been through hurricanes before. Kimberly knew it was true. Storms came, storms went. People left, people stayed. But this time was different. She felt it in her bones. Back at her house, her husband Scott sat on the couch watching the news. His face was unreadable. They say it's a Category 5 now, he muttered. That made her stomach drop. Category 5 meant destruction, meant floodwaters, rooftops, bodies floating down the streets. We should leave, she said. With what car? Scott exhaled hard. You see these people leaving? They got somewhere to go, money to get there. We ain't got either. That was the reality for thousands of people in the lower Ninth. They weren't staying because they wanted to. They were staying because they had no choice. Kimberly picked up her camera, hit record. The grainy image of her own face stared back at her. She spoke directly, into the lens. If this is my last tape, if this storm takes us, somebody needs to know what happened here. Outside, the wind had started to change. The first warning. The first whisper of the storm that would soon drown a city and expose a truth no one was ready to face. The wind started howling long before the rain came. It wasn't the kind of wind that whistled through trees or rattled windows. No, this wind roared. It screamed like something alive, something furious. The kind of sound that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. Kimberly sat on the floor of their small living room, knees pulled to her chest, camera in hand. The power flickered, casting strange shadows on the peeling walls. Outside, the world was coming apart. This is it, Scott muttered, pacing. This is the one that's gonna take us out. The wind picked up. Then came the rain. At first, it pattered against the windows like impatient fingertips. But within minutes, it was slamming against the glass, sideways, like the sky itself had cracked open. A loud crack. Somewhere outside, a tree split in half. The TV let out a long, high-pitched beep before cutting to static. Then, the power died. Darkness. Only the sound of the storm remained. Kimberly pressed record. "If anyone ever sees this," her voice trembled, we still hear." The house shuddered. Then the water came, not a slow seep through the walls, not a creeping flood from the streets. No, this was instant, as if someone had dumped an entire ocean into their neighborhood at once. The first wave ripped the front door off its hinges. A black wall of water crashed inside, knocking over furniture, slamming Scott into the kitchen counter. Kimberly barely had time to grab her camera before the water lifted her off her feet. Go up! Go up!" Scott shouted, shoving her toward the attic door. Kimberly fought the current, the freezing water swallowing her legs, her waist, her chest. She couldn't breathe. She grabbed the attic pull string, yanked it down, and climbed. Scott came next, water dragging at his legs. He gritted his teeth, pushed himself up. Behind him, their living room disappeared beneath the flood. Then silence. Only the wind howling outside, the sound of water rising. Kimberly pressed her face against the attic vent. Outside, under flashes of lightning, she saw her city drowning. Rooftops barely visible above the black water. People screaming for help. Somewhere, someone was praying. The storm had come, and New Orleans was sinking. The attic was suffocating. It smelled of dust, sweat, and fear. The air was thick, stale, heavy with the heat of too many bodies pressed together, waiting, listening. Kimberly sat near the vent, her camera clutched in her hands, recording everything. She had to. If they didn't make it, at least the world would know. Scott sat beside her, his shirt drenched, his chest rising and falling too fast. The water below had stopped rising for now, but it was already waist-deep in their house. If the rain kept coming, if the levees kept failing, they were trapped. Outside, the wind still howled, but underneath it, Kimberly could hear something worse. Screams, not distant, close. She pressed her face against the vent, peering down at the water below. A man clung to a telephone pole, his body half submerged, his eyes wide with terror. "Somebody help, please!" His voice cracked, desperate. No one answered. Further down the street, a woman floated on a door, one arm wrapped tightly around a little girl. The child wasn't moving. Kimberly's stomach twisted. "We have to get out of here," she whispered. Scott let out a hollow laugh. "And go where?" Kimberly scanned the attic, her mind racing. There was no way out. The only exit was the way they came in, through the house, through the flood. No, there had to be another way. She grabbed a broken broomstick from the corner and slammed it into the attic ceiling. Nothing. She hit it again, and again, harder. The wood splintered. A small hole cracked open, letting in a rush of humid air. Scott's eyes widened. "Kim, what are you doing?" "Getting us out." She kept hitting, widening the hole. A gust of wind tore through the gap, making her shiver. The storm was still out there, still tearing the city apart. But it didn't matter. Staying meant dying. She turned back to Scott. "We climb onto the roof. We find a way to help those people." Scott exhaled, shaking his head. But he didn't argue. Because he knew. Just like she did, no one was coming to save them. If they wanted to live, they had to save themselves. Kimberly took a deep breath, her fingers raw from clawing at the wooden beams. The hole she had punched into the attic ceiling was finally big enough. Outside, the wind had calmed, but the world beneath them was still drowning. Scott boosted her up, and she hauled herself onto the roof. The metal shingles were slick beneath her hands, wet from the storm, but she barely noticed. What lay before her stole her breath away. The lower Ninth Ward was gone. Where streets used to be, there was only water, dark, endless, swallowing everything in its path. Homes, cars, streetlights, all buried beneath the flood. The city she had grown up in, the neighborhood where people sat on porches and played music late into the night, was unrecognizable. And then, the voices. "Help! Please!" Kimberly turned toward the sound. 3 houses down, an old man clung to a chimney, his legs trembling. On another roof, a young mother rocked a crying baby, her face streaked with tears. Further out, a boy, older than 10, floated on a broken door, his little fingers gripping the edge so tightly his knuckles had gone white. She felt her stomach tighten. No one was coming for them. No helicopters, no rescue boats, no National Guard. Just silence, just water, just them. Scott's voice came from behind her. "Kim, we gotta move. If we stay out here too long, we have to help them." Her own words surprised her, but the second they left her mouth, she knew there was no other choice. Scott frowned. "Kim, Scott." She turned to him, gripping his arm. "Look around you. Look at them. We can't just sit here and watch them die." His jaw clenched, his eyes darting between her and the rising sun reflecting off the black water. She could see the fear in him, but she could also see something else, the same thing burning in her chest, the part of them that refused to let this be the end. Scott exhaled sharply, then nodded once. "Okay, what's the plan?" Kimberly scanned the water, her mind racing. That's when she saw it, an old aluminum fishing boat, half submerged but still floating. "There," she pointed. "We get that boat. We pull as many people in as we can." Scott followed her gaze, then let out a low whistle. "That thing's barely holding together." "Neither is this city," she shot back. Scott let out a breath, then nodded again. "All right, let's go be heroes." Kimberly grabbed her camera, wiped the lens with the back of her hand, and hit record. "If anybody ever sees this..." She paused, swallowing the lump in her throat. "We ain't waiting for help. We're becoming it." She turned off the camera, took one last deep breath, and slid into the water. It was time to save lives. The water was thick, murky, heavy, full of things she couldn't see and didn't want to feel. Kimberly pushed forward, her breath coming in sharp bursts as she swam toward the half-sunken boat. Every stroke felt slower, heavier. Her jeans clung to her legs, her arms ached, but stopping wasn't an option. Scott was right behind her, his movement strong, steady. He was scared. She knew that. But fear had no place here, not now. They reached the boat. Up close, it looked even worse. Dented, rusted, barely afloat, but it would have to do. Scott hoisted himself in first, rocking the boat dangerously before he steadied it. Then he reached for her. Their fingers met, wet, cold, desperate, and he pulled her up. Kimberly scanned the flooded streets. People were still out there, clinging to roofs, to trees, to anything that could keep them from sinking. She picked up her camera, pressed record. "If anyone ever sees this..." She took a shaky breath. "New Orleans is underwater, and no one is coming to save us." The words felt too real, too final. She swallowed hard and turned the camera off. This wasn't about documenting anymore. This was about survival. "There!" Scott pointed toward a rooftop where an old man clung to a gutter, his body trembling from exhaustion. Kimberly grabbed a wooden plank floating nearby and used it to paddle. The boat moved sluggishly, resisting them, but they forced it forward. Sir, can you move?" Kimberly called out as they neared. The old man turned his head slowly. His eyes were tired, too tired. I can't..." His voice was weak, barely audible over the eerie silence of the drowned city. Kimberly's heart pounded. "Yes, you can." She leaned over the side, reaching for him. She wouldn't let him go. Scott moved fast, sliding to the edge of the boat. "Come on, old man, we got you." The man hesitated, then let go. For a terrifying second, he disappeared beneath the water. Kimberly's breath caught, but then Scott's hands shot down, gripping the man's soaked shirt, yanking him up. He fell into the boat, coughing, gasping, but alive. Kimberly exhaled hard. "We're gonna get you somewhere safe, okay?" The man nodded weakly, his lips trembling. They turned the boat toward the next house, and the next, and the next. Each time, more hands reached for them, more voices begged, more people who had been left behind, and with every pull, every rescue, one thing became painfully clear. They weren't just saving lives. They were holding up a city that the world had already let go. The boat drifted through what used to be streets, now just a black sea, stretching endlessly in every direction. The air was thick with heat and the sharp, foul stench of floodwater. Rotting wood, gasoline, death. Kimberly's arms ached from paddling. Her body screamed for rest, but there was no time, not while people were still out there. Scott sat at the back of the boat, guiding them through the wreckage. The old man they had pulled in earlier lay slumped against the side, his chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Next to him, a woman held her baby tight, rocking him gently, whispering something only a mother could understand. They had saved 6 people so far, but the boat was getting heavier. They couldn't take much more weight. Kimberly scanned the rooftops ahead. More survivors. Too many. A woman waved desperately from the top of a house, her voice raw from screaming. Beside her, a teenage boy held onto a broken antenna, his eyes darting wildly between them and the endless water below. Kimberly's chest tightened. "Scott, I see him," he said. They paddled closer. "Please," the woman cried out. "My son, he can't swim. Please." Kimberly's heart pounded. She knew what was coming. Scott gave her a look. "Kim, the boat's full." She clenched her jaw. "We can fit 2 more. And then what? We sink? We drown with them?" The woman sobbed, clutching the boy's arm. Kimberly could see the terror in his face, the same terror she had felt when the water crashed through her front door. Scott's hands gripped the sides of the boat, frustration in every tense muscle. Kimberly turned to the survivors already on board. Tired faces, weak bodies. No one had the strength to argue, but she had to make a choice. She turned back to Scott. "We get them in, then we find higher ground." Scott exhaled sharply but nodded. "All right. But after this, no more." Kimberly reached out. The boy jumped first, landing hard in the boat, water sloshing over the sides. The mother followed, shaking, clutching her son like he was the only thing keeping her together. The boat groaned under the weight. Scott cursed under his breath. "This thing's gonna tip." Kimberly didn't answer. She couldn't. Because ahead of them, just beyond the rooftops past the debris floating in the endless flood, she saw something. A bridge, dry ground, maybe safety, maybe hope. She gripped the paddle tighter. They weren't done yet. The bridge had been their salvation. For a moment, standing on dry concrete, it felt like they had finally made it. But safety was a cruel illusion. From the bridge, Kimberly could see thousands gathered outside the Superdome, a massive stadium that once hosted football games and concerts. Now it was something else, a refuge, a last resort, a trap. People were packed shoulder to shoulder, pressed against the barricades, begging to be let inside. Babies cried, their mothers rocking them with hollow eyes. The elderly sat on the pavement, too weak to stand. Kimberly tightened her grip on the camera. She needed to record this. The world had to see. Scott exhaled sharply beside her. "Kim, this ain't right." It wasn't. They moved toward the entrance, pushing through the restless crowd. Heat radiated off bodies. The air was thick with sweat, fear, and something worse, hopelessness. At the doors, armed guards stood like statues, rifles slung across their chests. "We got women and kids," Scott called out, waving an arm. "They need food, water." One of the guards barely glanced at him. "Ain't got room." Kimberly felt her stomach drop. "What do you mean, ain't got room? People are dying out here." The guard didn't flinch. "Ain't my problem." Anger burned through her exhaustion. "What the hell do you mean it ain't your problem? This is your city." The guard exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. Ain't no city left, lady. Kimberly stared at him, breath shaking. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? New Orleans wasn't a city anymore. It was a graveyard, a prison, a forgotten place. She turned the camera toward the crowd, mothers pleading, fathers holding their families together by sheer will, old men sitting in silence waiting for death. She hit record. If anybody ever sees this, this is what they did to us. Scott pulled her arm. Come on, Kim, we got to figure something else out. Kimberly turned off the camera. Because if the Superdome wasn't salvation, then where the hell could they go? The city smelled like death and salt water. Kimberly stepped over the shattered remains of a store window, her camera hanging from her neck. The flood had receded, but it left scars behind, ones that wouldn't wash away. The lower Ninth Ward was unrecognizable. Houses were nothing but wooden skeletons, broken apart like forgotten toys. Cars rested on rooftops, flipped over like the storm had tossed them aside without care. A bloated dog lay on the pavement, unmoving. Scott walked beside her, his face set in stone. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. They had survived. But what now? Kimberly adjusted the camera strap, lifted it, and hit record. This is what's left of my home. She turned, capturing the emptiness, the devastation, the silence. We waited for help. Her voice didn't shake this time. It was steel. No one came. Scott let out a breath beside her. What do we do now, Kim? She lowered the camera. What did they do now? She thought back to that attic, to the flood rising beneath them, to the moment she had made a choice, not to wait, to fight, and she knew. We tell the truth. Scott met her eyes. We show them what they don't want to see. For the first time in days, he nodded. Kimberly lifted the camera again. This was their city, their story, and the world was going to hear it. The screen flickered. Then the images came. Flooded streets, bodies floating in murky water, children crying in the arms of exhausted mothers, families stranded on rooftops, waving desperately at helicopters that never came. Kimberly sat in the back of a crowded room, watching as the footage from her camera played on a projector screen. People gasped, some wiped their eyes, others just sat there, stunned. They weren't in New Orleans anymore. They weren't in the ruins of the lower Ninth Ward. They were in New York City. A documentary studio had picked up her footage, calling it raw, unfiltered, a testament to survival. They didn't know. They didn't know what it felt like to climb onto a roof, not knowing if you'd survive the night. They didn't know what it was like to paddle past bodies, past people screaming for help, knowing you couldn't save them all. They didn't know the anger, the betrayal, the moment you realized your own country had left you to die. But now they were seeing it, and they couldn't look away. The film ended. Silence filled the room, heavy, unshakable, then applause. But not the kind that came after a movie, not entertainment, not admiration. This was different. This was recognition, acknowledgement, understanding. Kimberly's hands clenched in her lap. She didn't want applause. She wanted justice. A journalist leaned over, microphone in hand. Kimberly, how does it feel to have your story out there? To have the world finally see? What happened? She took a deep breath, met his gaze. It's not my story. The reporter blinked. Kimberly turned to the screen, the frozen image of a flooded home, of a woman wading through chest-deep water, holding a baby above her head. It's theirs. She wasn't a hero, she wasn't special. She had just done what she had to do. And now the world had no excuse. The city would never be the same. Years had passed, but the scars of Hurricane Katrina still etched themselves into the bones of New Orleans. Some houses had been rebuilt, streets repaved, businesses reopened. But in the lower Ninth Ward, where the flood hit the hardest, the emptiness remained. Boarded up homes, weeds swallowing front yards, silence where music once filled the air. Kimberly stood in front of what used to be her home. The waterline was still visible on the walls, a brown stain of everything they had lost. She lifted her camera, fingers grazing the edges, the same one that had captured the truth, the same one that had forced the world to see what had happened here. "You ever gonna put that thing down?" She turned. Scott leaned against the rusted frame of their old truck, arms crossed, a smirk tugging at his lips. His face was older now, his eyes wiser. Kimberly exhaled a laugh, shaking her head. "Not today." She hit record. "I used to think this camera was just for me." She turned, capturing the street, the ghosts of what once was, the fight of what still remained. "But now I know. It's for all of us." She had thought survival was the end of the story, that making it out alive was enough. But survival was just the beginning. The real fight was making sure no one forgot, because the next storm would come, the next tragedy, the next moment where people would have to decide, wait for help or become it. She had made her choice, and she would never stop telling the story. Kimberly's story isn't just about survival, it's about choice. When the world turned its back, she stepped up. When no one came, she became the help. And now, I have to ask you, what would you do? If everything you knew was washed away overnight, if no one came to save you, would you wait or would you fight? Because the truth is, you don't have to face a hurricane to decide. Every single day, people around you are drowning in struggle, in injustice, in silence. So here's the real question. Are you watching from the sidelines, or are you stepping in to make a difference? Drop a comment below. What's one moment in your life where you had to be stronger than you thought possible? I want to hear your story. And if this video moved you, if it made you think, don't let it end here. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us as we uncover more powerful stories that the world needs to hear. Because sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones who never expected, Toby.